In today's quick tip, we're going to talk about why it's important to plan your passage, and specifically the effect that wind direction, speed and tide can have on whether your passage is safe and smooth or a nightmare that you will never want to go back to. Okay, so, excuse me, cup of coffee. What do we need to know about passage planning? Well, we've done a video on passage planning in more detail, which is up here, and I would thoroughly recommend that you go and have a look at that. And if you're looking at that, you can even download the free passage plan pro forma, which I've created, which you're more than happy to use as a base for your next passage plan. In that passage planning, we talk about tide direction and weather. And obviously those two things are important, but why are they important? Well, first of all, weather should be pretty obvious. You don't want to be going to sea in very bad weather, but what is bad weather? For example, a force 7 in one direction might be extremely unpleasant and very, very hard work. A force 7 in another direction might be very, it might help you speed along and might be the sort of thing that you want. And why is it that sometimes you get very big steep seas in a force 6 or a force 7 and other times you get a relatively innocuous effect on the sea state, and you've got the wind, you've got the speed that gives you, but you haven't got the sea state that goes with the force 7 that you had the other day. Why is that? Okay, well, that's really to do with what is happening to the combination of wind direction and speed and water direction and speed. If you imagine, if you're sailing along a coast, now where I sail is primarily on the south coast of England when I'm in the UK. And if I'm sailing from the Isle of Wight to, say, Weymouth, which is about 60 miles west of Cowes, if I'm sailing along in a force 4, then from any wind direction, really, a force 4 is going to be quite pleasant sailing. In fact, you might want the force 4 to be forward of the beam or on the beam. And why would you want that? You want to create more wind from the wind that you've got. And to do that, if the wind is forward of the beam, you're going to increase as you speed up your apparent wind and create more force in the sails. You're sailing, the force of wind that you can use to sail will be better if you're sailing into the wind at an angle, ideally maybe a close reach or a beam reach. You're getting more out of the wind that you've got. If you're sailing along in a heavy boat with a force 4 from behind, then you might find that if you're travelling along at 4 or 5 knots and the force 4 was giving you 15 knots, and if you're not sure, by the way, how to work out the difference between Beaufort scale and wind speed in knots, you can, again, check out our video here, which we've done on the subject. But if you're trundling along in 15 knots of wind and you're doing 5 knots, then you're going to have a 10 knot apparent wind. That means you're only really feeling 10 knots. And sailing the boat with a 10 knot apparent wind is not going to be pushing it to its top speeds. If you were sailing along into 4 knots, and say on a close reach, 60 degrees off your bow, then that would give you an increase in apparent wind, which would push the boat faster and give you more speed. So sometimes sailing into wind gives you a higher apparent wind, which is still well within the need to reduce the power in your sails or by reefing. And you might find that sailing into a low breeze, into a light breeze, is more effective than sailing downwind in a light breeze. Now, of course, a way around this is to have a big, lightweight downwind sail. This would be a cruising chute or a spinnaker or a jenniker or asymmetric sail. So we'll talk about that in another video, but That does give you the benefit of collecting as much wind as possible, but you've still got the problem that your boat is going to speed up, and as it speeds up, the apparent wind in your downwind sail is going to reduce. So sometimes sailing upwind in, say, a force 3 or even a force 4 can give you a better boat speed and actually be a more enjoyable sail. However, those instances are fairly few and far between. Normally, you don't want to be sailing upwind, you don't want to be beating unless you have to. Gentlemen never beat to windward, as they say. So what do you do in terms of planning then? Well, if you're looking at, let's say, a force 6. So a force 6 is generally referred to as a yachtsman's gale. So you're probably talking about 25 knots-ish, 25 knots of gradient wind. And you should expect, if you've got a 25 knot forecast gradient wind, that you may end up getting gusts of maybe 40% more than that. So you could be looking at 35 knot gusts, and a 35 knot gradient wind would be a force 8. So you can see why that might be called a yachtsman's gale. In a small yacht, a force 6 is going to feel like a force 8 might on a larger yacht or a small ship. Okay, so where is that force 6 coming from? If it's coming forward of the beam, if it's coming from a close reach, you're increasing your apparent wind speed. You're driving in towards the wind, and that's increasing apparent wind speed. We're going to do a video on apparent and true wind, which I will link to this video in due course. Therefore, going downwind or on a beam reach or a broad reach is going to be much more beneficial to you and much more comfortable than going upwind in that sort of wind speed. But if you need to go to a particular place and the wind's coming from the place it's coming from, you're not going to have that choice. But you can plan for this in your passage. So if going west along the south coast of England, you have a forecast force 6 coming from the north or even from the northeast, you can imagine that's going to be a lot more comfortable than if it's coming from the southwest or the northwest. And a southwesterly wind is going to be a lot more uncomfortable than a northwesterly wind. So why is that? The wind's coming from the same direction to you, you're going west, so the wind is the same true wind direction. But why would a northwesterly be more comfortable on the south shore going west than a southwesterly? Well, those of you that sail in that area will have that in your mind already, and you'll probably guess why. If the wind is coming from land over the sea, first of all, the wind near the coast, where it's coming from the land and coming over the sea, will be accelerating, but it won't have had a great deal of time to accelerate. The friction of the land, will have slowed the wind down slightly. The wind direction will change. We'll talk about that in another video on headlands. But also, we won't have the fetch that you would have from a southwesterly. So what's a fetch? The fetch is the distance of water over which the wind has had an opportunity to blow. So the longer the distance, the more effect it can have on the sea state, and this is important for passage planning. So not only if the wind is coming forward of the beam are you going to get an increased apparent wind, so it'll seem windier to you and you may have to start reefing, but also if it's coming from over land and you're near the land, it's going to have a lesser effect on sea state, and you may end up with quite a smooth sea, a relatively calm sea compared with if you're a few miles out. And certainly if you had a southwesterly. If you're bashing into a southwesterly on your way to Weymouth, that's going to give you all sorts of problems with your passage plan from Cowes, which I'll talk about in another video. But the primary one to be thinking about is what effect that's going to have both on your boat speed. As you're crashing into waves, you're going to have a bigger fetch coming all the way from the western approaches out from the Atlantic. So you're going to look at a relatively big sea state if the wind's been blowing like that for a while. You're going to be driving into those waves because you're going west. Your wind speed, your apparent wind speed, is going to be higher because you're driving into the wind, or as close to the wind as you can sail. So all of those things together are probably going to mean that you're going to need to reef your sailboat. And once you reef your sailboat, that might balance the boat against the speed of the wind and the power that's in the wind. But you're also reducing, to some extent, the damping of the vessel in a big sea. So you've got less sail area to damp the pitching and rolling of your sailboat. And you're going to have less power. So if you've got less power in your boat, then in the lulls, you're going to find the waves are going to have a much worse effect on you and a much more uncomfortable effect on you than if you had more power in the boat. So a rookie error sometimes is to over-reef, to take too much power out of your sailboat when it's windy and there's a big sea state. Now, this is why it's important that you know and can trust your vessel and that you've done rig checks and you do regular rig checks, because you need to be able to trust that your vessel can take a little bit of punishment. And whilst you need to be careful about how much punishment you give your vessel, at the same time, sometimes it can seem sensible to reduce sail when it's very windy, because it feels that's a sensible thing to do. But if you lose too much power, you haven't got the drive required to keep control of the vessel in a big sea, especially when going upwind. So that is something which we'll talk about in heavy weather sailing. But getting back to passage planning, you can see now why a northerly or a northeasterly, when you're going west towards Weymouth and the wind is coming from the shore over the sea and you're near the coastline, is going to make for a much more comfortable sail than if you are going west to Weymouth in the same wind strength of a southwesterly with a long fetch from the Atlantic bringing in big seas and no obstructions and the wind blowing at full speed. Remember that a wind forecast is given over a relatively large area. Even an inshore forecast is given over quite a large area. So, for example, from Selseybill, Portsmouth, to Lyme Regis, which is west of Weymouth, a long way west of Weymouth. So you can imagine that your average gradient wind speed is going to be just that, an average gradient wind speed, and it will vary dramatically dependent on land effect. So land effect is really important when you're in a coastal passage. So going from Cowes to Weymouth in a northerly for 6 might be an enjoyable fast sail, but doing it in a southwesterly for 6 might be an incredibly unpleasant, perhaps even, dependent on your crew and your vessel, dangerous. So why then is it that, say for part of the day, you might have found that southwesterly you could cope with, but then a couple of hours later the sea state seems to have built considerably? Why was that? The wind speed hasn't changed. Well, that's down to tide and also the effect of the seabed. So tide is something we want to use to our best benefit. So we want to leave and be sailing on that tide for as long as possible. Not necessarily leaving on the tide, but we want to be on that tide at the critical tidal gates, which in the passage I'm talking about, if you know this area, one of the critical tidal gates is going to be going through the Needles Channel if you go that way. And the other tidal gate is going to be getting round St Albans Ledge, which is a headland with some shallows. And there are also some restrictions on navigation in that area. So you need to hit those 2 tidal gates at the right time to get through. So you're going to be on tide. But if you've got a northeasterly, that's great. You've got wind behind you, you've got tide behind you, everything's in your favour. Nice smooth water, and it's coming from the land. Great. However, if it's a southwesterly again, same wind speed, so 4-6 again, and that southwesterly has got a long fetch and is bringing in quite a big sea state, and then on top of that you're sitting on a tide, and perhaps it's a spring tide, so you've got full tidal effect, twice the normal tide speed running than on a neap. You might be sitting on 3 knots of tide going west. You're going west on 3 knots of tide. That's it. Initially, that's already given you almost a 3 knot apparent wind speed increase, even if there was no wind, because you're sitting on a conveyor belt taking you west. On top of that, you've got a southwesterly wind blowing on your nose, which means that your apparent wind, as you start to accelerate on that wind, your apparent wind is going up. The wind's coming from forward of the beam. You've got the sea state already, and then on top of that, you've got that sea state running in the opposite direction to the wind coming on your nose. So the wind on your nose blowing against the tide that's underneath you going in the opposite direction is going to increase the amount and the frequency, the increase the wave size and the frequency of the waves that you are encountering. So not only are you now smashing into waves that are being driven by the wind, but you're smashing into bigger waves at a shorter frequency. And in the channel in particular, this is particularly unpleasant. The channel can be very unpleasant for this very reason. Relatively shallow water, relatively high frequency of wave set, and you can get some big blows blowing through there, and it can get very, very uncomfortable. And then, of course, you're getting yourself into a really nasty situation where the wind over tide is giving you sharper, steeper seas. Going around to St Albans Ledge as an example, you've got shallower water, so you've got tide pushing up and causing overfalls, which are marked on the chart. On top of that, you have got a lee shore now, because you've got a southwesterly blowing you towards the shore. So if you get into problems, you've got a lee shore on your northern, on your starboard side, to the north. So all of a sudden, what could have been an enjoyable sail on a spring tide from the east, going west, flying through tidal gates with a northeasterly blowing from your starboard quarter, giving you a relatively manageable apparent wind speed, relatively low wave sets because the wind hasn't had a chance to give you the fetch that's required to build the waves, and to some extent you're sheltered from the full extent of the wind by the coast. All of a sudden, from that being a nice passage, a sporty but challenging and enjoyable passage, you've then gone to beating into a force 6 southwesterly, wind against tide, springs, with a potential lee shore. Trying to get round a headland in that situation will be very difficult, and as the tide starts to ease, you're going to have a decision to make. Because once the tide pushes against you with that wind, whilst the sea state might ease slightly after an hour or two, you're going to find it almost impossible to get round, for example, in this state, St Albans Ledge. So this is why passage planning is important, and this is why weather and tide are important. Where's the wind coming from? Are you going to get an increase in apparent wind because you're beating into that weather? Remember, the wind is going to drive the wave direction in most instances, unless there's been a big wind shift in the recent past. And remember that if the wind is coming from overland to the sea, then if you're near land, you're going to benefit from little in the way of fetch building a big sea state. So when you're doing your passage planning, remember to look at weather, what's the wind speed, what's going to happen to the wind speed and direction, and what is the tide and tide direction. And if you incorporate those into your passage plan, plus your normal bits and pieces like ports of refuge and where you would go if the wind shifts, etc., you're going to have the start of a rock solid passage plan, which is going to mean that you get you and your family and friends safe to your port of destination. And on that point, just remember one last thing: a passage which might be safe and enjoyable on a 40-ton, 70-foot boat with 15 experienced crew might be a very different experience on an 8-ton, 32-foot boat with the wife and 2 small children. So always allow for the vessel you're on and the crew that you have available to you. Okay, so I hope that helped. That's a longer video than normal, and hopefully that goes into a bit more into the detail of why these things are important in a passage plan. My coffee's gone cold. Okay, speak to you again soon. Cheers. I hope you found this short video tutorial useful. If you did, please click the like button. This helps promote the video on YouTube. If you've got any of your own tips or experience you'd like to share, or you've got an idea for a video, let me know in the comments section below. And if you aren't already a subscriber, consider subscribing and remember to click the little bell so you're notified when I release my next video. There are various links that might interest you in the description section under this video. Until next time, sail safe.